And to bring that back to threats to men, I've watched some really great stuff on, like, let's call it mass hypnosis. And when you look at things like Darren Brown in this country, he would create a scene to see how far someone would go if they'd killed someone because they thought they'd done something they shouldn't. And of course, everybody but that person would be an actor. And in the end, that person would pull the trigger or just about to. And you realize how easy some people are being hypnotized. And unfortunately, a lot of people are sleepwalking through life, like questioning everything. So questioning like where you are in life, and then questioning things around you, because I think there's a lack of that at the moment. What am I putting in my body? What am I letting people inject me with? What's being sprayed in the air? What am I watching on TV? What clothes am I putting in my back? The sooner you start kind of questioning, why am I being told this? What's someone's ulterior motive? That can open up a real kind of a pathway for you to become more awake, basically.
Let me ask you a question. Who are you? Depending on how you answer that reveals a lot about how we measure ourselves. And if you're like me, many times the first thing out of my mouth will be something about a profession or a career. But then if I take time to think about it, things like fatherhood, husband, and mentor might come to mind. Notice how I've yet, though, to mention the parts of me of what I don't care to reveal. Those parts like where I'm a judge and jury, where I'm anxious and I'm fearful. See, these are also parts of who I am. And yet for me to be a whole man, I must be prepared to accept and integrate all of me, and even the parts that I don't like. And today my guest shares with us how he is guiding men to be whole and complete. But before we get into all that, I just want to remind you, if you're interested in raising your standards as a father, a husband, and an entrepreneur, then I encourage you to start your hero's quest. In this program, you will discover more about yourself, accomplish more, and develop more than you have in the next 90 days and you have all of last year. And you can get all this information at the Awakened Man Training Academy at members.theawakenedman.net. And with that, let's get on with today's episode.
The average man today is sleepwalking through life, many never reaching their true potential, let alone ever crossing the finish line to living a purposeful life. Yet, the hunger still exists, albeit buried amidst his cluttered mind, misguided beliefs, and values that no longer serve him. It's time to align yourself for greatness. It's time to become a revolutionary man. Stay strong, my brother.
Welcome, everyone, to the Revolutionary Man podcast. I'm the founder of the Awakened Man movement and your host, Alan DeMonso. So let me ask you a couple of questions. Who are you? And what are you leaving out about who you are? Getting to know our true selves is both an inside job, along with an ascension process and a descension journey. And today, my guest and I dive into what it means to be that whole man. Allow me to introduce my guest. Anthony Asbury has spoken to companies like Spotify, Barclays Bank, Daily Mail Group, Credit Suisse, Domestic and General, Lloyds Bank, and plenty more. He's also the founder of the Whole Man Academy, an organization that started in 2018 that has helped men live epic lives through powerful events, bespoke mentoring and coaching. And he also has over 120 plus podcast episodes that helps guide this message. He also has developed a 3-day retreat to help men find more about themselves. He's also created a 1-day reset morning routine and the Energy Protocol online course for professional men who want to recharge their biological batteries. Welcome to the show, Anthony. How are things today, my brother?
Thank you. It's a great intro. And as a fellow podcaster, I'm always interested to see how podcasts start, because some people just roar off, others give a good kind of like yourself. And, I've done it sometimes where I get halfway through and then I cock it up and I'm like, shit. So hats off to you already for that. That was impressive. But how am I? Well, your listeners won't know, but we had our third baby last week, or I didn't because men can't have babies, but my partner Emma did. And so this last week of, having a newborn is kind of, it's beautiful because you just got to spend a lot of time watching them basically sleep on your chest and do stuff like that, which is nice. And excited to be speaking to you today about men's stuff.
Oh, outstanding. Absolutely. So looking forward to it. I can remember both my boys are into their 30s now. And so it's been a long time since I've had that feeling. I said that, but now I should back up a bit. Our grandson's coming over tomorrow and he's 4. So maybe I haven't had as much of that, but it's nice to see the little pitter patter of feet around the home again. As I was saying in the beginning, in the intro there, Anthony, in our work here at the Awakened Man, all of us are on our own hero's quest, our own hero's journey. So my first question for you is to tell us about a time in your life when you knew things had to change. What did you do about it? And how did that experience shape you into the man you are today and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I've got two kind of, often on the podcast, it's good to have kind of like a timeline, and I'll share two I'll cut them short so I can share two instead of one. But first one was when I was in my 20s. I was not super fit, but I was fit. I played a lot of football and was always good at running and stuff like that. And basically, I had a collapsed lung. So, it wasn't through an accident. It was called a spontaneous pneumothorax, which means that basically, for whatever reason, your lung collapses. And that kind of sent me on a bit of a journey because it happened a couple of times and I basically wasn't allowed to do any exercise or get out of breath or anything for probably in total about 6 months. And as a young man who also was single, so you couldn't do any exercise of that kind either. But it was a tough time because I was basically stuck at home recovering. But what that did was give me two things. One, when I got back to full fitness, it gave me new appreciation for football or just sport. But for me, it was running back on that pitch. And, I got told at one point I might not play to a high standard again. And, that season I went back. I mean, I won player of the year, managers player of the year. I was top of all the tests because suddenly I appreciated running out on that kind of turf. And what that did, because I lost a lot of weight, I mean, I wasn't big anyway, but, I kind of wasted away for 6 months of not doing anything. It set me on that journey of learning about men and their health and more body than mind to start with. I probably didn't give a toss about the mind. I just wanted to look like a cover model, if that makes sense, and be strong and fit. So that got me interested in that side of things. And then fast forward pretty much 20 years from that, I worked in the city for, a long period as a trader for a short amount of time, then as a broker. Loved it for a while, and things were good. You earned good money, and you were surrounded by hundreds of guys, and you had lots of fun. You took clients out to expensive restaurants and went skiing into Ibiza and blah blah blah, all that stuff. But at some point, you start looking around and thinking, "Is this it? Is this what I'm going to carry on doing? Getting up at 5:30, 200 hours a month at your desk, and basically earning money for other people. You were still doing it for yourself, but you just felt unfulfilled." And that led me into, and I always joke, my partner said to me, Emma, who I've now been with for 10 years, said, you should start listening to podcasts. And I was like, I'm not listening to podcasts. I'm busy. I'm busy being busy. I've got stuff to do. Like, don't be ridiculous. And it turns out she was right because, the first two podcasts I listened to, that's the first time I heard the words Tony Robbins and personal development pretty much. And that started me off on the path of realizing I could leave my, let's call it 6-figure salary and, desk job to go off and do something more fulfilling. And now I'll pass it back to you. So that's my two.
Yeah, I love that. And a couple of notes here. I'll be taking lots of notes as I normally do. So don't mind me looking down here. But I was just a couple of notes I just made. There was just the appreciation that we get when something happens in our life. And that's why I always like to start off the podcast with having guys share this part of their story, because I think we tend to forget the appreciation and the gratitude for the things that we have until something tells us that maybe we can't have that, and for you as a medical condition. And then when we realize that, just how much stronger we come back, because now we can actually start to work with that energy. And the other piece I made a note is just, I was the same way a few years back, and my wife would say, well, you should listen to a podcast, or I talk to my buddies and listen to podcasts. I'm not spending any time listening to podcasts. I got to tell you, I have a 45-minute commute every day. And that's what I listen to. There's a dozen or so podcasts that just rotate through my phone. And what a great way to learn about lots of different topics. And while we're talking about men's work today, there's lots of things for us to learn. You can learn everything from health and wealth, financial building, parenting, you name it. It's out there if we're willing and prepared to make use of that time that we think we don't have in our day.
Yeah, we've not got an excuse anymore. We're not short of resources, and most of them are free. So, people, you've just got to put in the hours. I always say, your personal trainer can't do your press ups for you, much as no one can do your personal development for you. You've got to put in the hours to listen to stuff and hopefully kind of apply some of it,
Absolutely. And then that's all it takes is to put something into action. It doesn't necessarily mean to do all of it, but to put something in action. But let me ask you about that. So you had, what was your biggest challenge that you had to overcome transitioning from this 20-year career? You're on the trading floor, you're doing trading, it's intense work, lots of energy. But what was that like for you to transition from focusing on that kind of work to then building the Whole Man Academy?
I think, yeah, two things. One of the big things was kind of fear, and that could be all encompassing, because fear, because when you earn, I mean, some people, I know people that, are billionaires, and I know people that are on the minimum wage. So I always say, I don't care what you drive, where you live, what you wear, what you do. It's about who you are. That for me is like, do I want to hang around with you? I don't give a shit about what else someone's got. But when you earn, let's say, a 6-figure salary, and you're used to the trappings of success of I had a nice BMW Z4 convertible that was brand new, and I had a nice townhouse and expensive watches, and we'd fly to Miami on holiday and spend 10 grand in a week and not bother about it too much. But then the fear of like, what if I can't do that stuff again, was one of the things for me, because it's not about what if I can't do that. It's like, what will people think of me if I'm not the person that I was, And that's where I look back at, soldiers that leave the forces, and, for them, they might be called a hero. And then when you leave, you're just back to you, and you're not that person anymore. You're not what your role is. So fear of that was one for me. And I think the way I overcame that, I actually got myself a coach. So you can't, I do coaching and mentoring, and quite frankly, it's quite simple when you know how, because people don't need high level strategies. People need accountability, focus, and some support, to sometimes just bounce ideas off. But I paid, a good amount of money, and had, I think, about 24 coaching sessions from 2 different women who sometimes would just say, right, what's going on? And I'd be like, I'm thinking of leaving, but I'm, so scary. And they'd future kind of, how can I put it? They'd say to me, listen, you can carry on doing what you're doing, but how do you feel if you're still here in a month or a year or 5 years? And a month wouldn't seem that painful, but a year, you'd be like, oh, I can't do this for another year. Well, you better do something about it. And that for me, that's how I overcame the fear. So fear was the thing, but overcoming it was, was priceless, to be honest. And to be honest, the other thing was, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. So it's easy if you say, I'm leaving to be a plumber, or I'm leaving to be a something. But when you leave and you kind of want to do something, I'd done a personal performance diploma, like for coaching, and spent like nearly a year doing that. And I'd went and got all my like fitness and sport kind of accreditations, so I could officially help, I could talk about it and not just be like, oh, I read it in a magazine. But it took me, maybe a year from when I left the city. That was end of 2016. And it wasn't till mid 2018 that the Whole Man Academy thing was born. So it was an interesting time in between, because I was helping people with health and fitness, but I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing, if that makes sense. But one day the idea of the Whole Man Academy came to mind, and then kind of that's the next chapter.
Yeah, outstanding. And what I really appreciate about that story is you're talking about, the fear of us and having that trappings of success, and whatever level that looks like for us, right? And that the idea of, can I maintain and sustain the lifestyle I currently live, and how often does that affect our decision making, right? And it sounds like it wasn't necessarily a complete changeover, like I'm going to quit today because I'm going to start this thing tomorrow, because you weren't even clear on exactly what you wanted to do. And that's another thing I see so much with, even in, in my story and talking with other men, that we think we have to have all the steps lined up. And if we don't have them all lined up, well, then I can't take any action. But that's not true. We may not really know the end result. And even if we have a goal, it may not be the ultimate destination anyways. And so it's about taking that step, right?
It's a really important point, because I get asked a lot, guys that are not just guys, but primarily it's guys that I deal with through the Whole Man Academy. But you'll get asked about people. I know a lot of people, or I've dealt with, who are basically bored of their job, and they've got something else they either want to do or they're doing on the side, and should they quit? And you get different advice saying, tell the boss to stick it and just leave, and you can do it. And you're like, yeah, that's great, but if and when it goes wrong, you're in all sorts of trouble, especially if you're a lad in his 20s, you can kip on your mate's sofa or go back to mum and dad's, or do you know what I mean? You can go to Bali for another 6 months or what. But if you've got kids and mouths to feed and bills to pay and a mortgage and partner, and maybe car payments or kids at primary school, you're fucked if you do that. And very quickly, you're going to then become desperate. And that is not a good place to be. Yeah. So for me, I always say, there's always two parts to it. If you hate your job so much, you think, I'm suicidal, you need to just walk out and leave, speak to someone first, but ultimately you need to make the break. But if you're like, I really don't like my job, or it's a bit meh, then stay at it until you've built a minimum viable product. If you're obviously, you need to make money. And if you can see that, ascending as that's, you can let the basic salary, or the guaranteed, I should say, salary go at some point, knowing you're going to have something coming in. Because it's great to get pumped up and be like, yeah, I'm leaving, I'm doing my stuff. But on Tuesday morning, after 2 months, where you've got, not much, the bank account's going down like an egg timer, the sand in the egg timer, and you're scrabbling around, that is not a good place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just harkens back to when I was getting my coaching certification, and I had a chat with my mentor, Abe, and his story is similar to what you're saying as well. Like, he spent 5 years transitioning from his day job, building a minimum viable product to the point where he could now leave that profession he was doing to take on the work full time. And then from there, he became the president of the Canadian Coaching Federation. He just started his own brand of flourishing coaches now here. And it's just, I'm sure if I was to ask Abe today, where he thought his life would end up, he'd be saying, not really. Yeah. He just knew he liked to do something of service, to be of service. And he chose this path. Right. And I think as long as we have an inkling about where it's coming from, then I think we're on the right path.
Well, because you can never know who like you and I speaking today, we've never spoken before, but who's to know that something in the future means that you end up either connecting each other with someone else, or you end up in a partnership of some description, doing something. And that's the thing you can, and I love planning, I love that, but you can't navigate life without surprises. And some surprises are good and some surprises are bad, but sometimes you just meet someone, or something happens, or you get an opportunity at the right time, and you're like, you can't plan for that, basically.
No, absolutely not. And what we can do is be open and ready to receive that, right? And I call that being, conscious of my intuition, when that little voice that says, "Ooh, maybe I should do something," right? And or pick a certain just how we met was through a different interviewer. I had somebody else on my podcast, and this gentleman said, have you ever heard of this Anthony guy? He said, nope. What's he all about? And sent me a link to your information. I just thought, well, this is outstanding. And it just leads from that. But the intuition started with this other interview that resonated with me. Had I not had that interview, then could we have met today? Hard to say. I would suggest that probably not.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that links into, and I'm guessing your next question would be about the Whole Man Academy. But one of the big things there is that's what podcasting gives you is, let's say I've interviewed 125 guys, for argument's sake. If each of those guys, I then said, can you introduce me to 2 people in your network that you think were great? Suddenly you've exploded your network without having to spend any money, go anywhere, do much, create much effort or, kind of momentum towards it. And suddenly those 300 men, if you ask those 300 for one more, you go to another, suddenly you've got 600 men. Yeah. So we'll get onto the Whole Man Academy, but that's the great power of podcasting as well.
Absolutely. And I found that so much to be so true in this. And I'm so grateful that to have come from the point of what is a podcast, listening to it, to now actually hosting one and getting opportunity to meet some amazing people. And it's always a learning experience for me. I don't know if that's the same experience for you when you're doing your podcast, but I always find there's something I get out of it. I take a ton of notes as I look at and listen to what my guests are saying. I think it's such an opportunity for us to learn, because as the mentors, we need to get our tank filled as well. And one way we can do that is doing this kind of work. And so we're doing some pretty good stuff here, my friend. Yeah, let's get into the Whole Man Academy. Tell me a little bit about, the idea of it, how that it came to be, what its purpose is, and how it is that it's changing men's lives.
Yeah, so I'll take you back to, I call it a little big idea. because sometimes, you can have a little idea and you have no idea that it's going to become something big. To kind of break that down for you. And, 2018, it was like, do you know what? I've learned a lot about personal development. I've been to events and seen the power of, and, it sounds a bit corny to say transformation, but, sometimes guys, you need to get out out of your comfort zone and get into places and listen to new people. So basically, myself and another chap who started the Whole Man Academy, we hosted our first event in London back in, say, September 2018. And I always say, even though I'd invited, about 15 mates and we had about 15 others, worried none of them would turn up because, that's what people do. So, yeah, I'll come along, but then don't bother. But thankfully, 25 men-ish, or 24, 25 men, came in through the door, had a couple of speakers, really good day. Important part is really cool venue. So not some crappy hotel room that's a bit soulless, that's a bit cold and you feel like you need a hoodie with sticky carpet. It was a cool, you feel like it was a Soho House Group, one of their places. So it, very Chesterfield sofas, bit of paneling here and some interesting kind of stuff around. And just it was an experience, not just a event, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway, that was the first one. Very soon after, guys saying, when's the next one? So in 2019, hosted, I kind of forget, but about 8 or 9 events in London, some evening events, some full day events. And we'd go usually for maybe at some, you go for a burger and a beer afterwards as well, which was good fun. You'd bring some speakers in, you do some exercises, a bit like a wheel of life or something like that.
Nice.
And, no pressure on anybody to do anything, but often just, connect with others. And often some good stuff happened in the breaks because guys would start chatting and etc. And we had guys there from, I don't know if you're into Formula One, don't worry, it doesn't matter if you're not, but, Max Verstappen, who is the, current Formula One world champion, it was his performance coach who we had to come along and speak to us. So he dealt with Max, I think, from when he was about 16 to 18. So he would sit there and I was really interested, let alone everybody else there. And we'd have guys come in from, coaching and media and, banking, all these different kind of, fighters. Anyway, that pretty much was going very well and building nicely. And as we all know, in 2020, people decided to strip everybody of their freedom, which doesn't sit very well with me. I'm always quite happy to talk about. And it basically ruined my plans and a lot of people's plans and ruined a lot of people's lives and financial outlook as well. So, you can cry about it and that's fine, but you have to adapt or die, as the saying goes. So I'd always wanted to do a podcast, but I hadn't been pushed into it because there wasn't any urgency. So I very quickly threw about £2,500 at London Real, if you know the London Real podcast with Brian Rose. So I'd been listening to Brian Rose. He had a similar story to me. He was Wall Street and then London. He used to work for one of the competitors of what I worked for. And I listened to his podcasts and they did the podcast course. So anyway, I did that. That was really helpful. And we launched the podcast to try and create like this thought-provoking content for men, because, there's a lot of podcasts out there, but I wanted the guys to not just be the same people you can listen to on the top podcasts, if that makes sense. Because don't get me wrong, having big guests are great, but sometimes you've heard them on 8 podcasts. Whereas I like listening to guys that I'm like, you've said a couple of things today that I'm like, oh, I might have to listen to that again, so write that down. And ultimately, it was about getting guys together to talk to start with. But that's not A, enough, and B, it's not a business plan. Because events are really hard to run.
Yeah.
Because I would say getting bums on seats is the hardest bit, unless you've got a big marketing budget, which I had 0, basically. And word of mouth goes so far, but the hiring of venues is very expensive. And then you've got, the additional stuff and, you're taking big risks. So what we then launched was the coaching, which meant it was 1-to-1. We developed it, say the online course, energy protocol course, because we always think for a lot of guys, you're being bombarded with, your sleep's got to be on point and your food and your fitness and your relationships and your mindset and blah, blah, blah. And guys' testosterone levels are dropping rapidly, which there's good reason for that. But so that's another podcast in itself. And we tried to encapsulate the whole man being the reason why the guy that first set the Whole Man Academy up with me, he wanted it to focus primarily or purely on mental health. And I said, that's fine, but that's not what I want. I want it to be fitness, health, mindset, family, relationships, money, grooming, all these different things, because for me, that's what encapsulates a whole man. And I know guys who have got loads of money in the bank, a big house, great job, lovely family, but they're really overweight and they're unhappy. Whereas I know guys that have got a great body, loving family, freedom in their job, what have you, but they're skint for whatever reason and the business is doing badly. Yeah. Well, you wouldn't say they need mental health help. You'd say they need financial and physical and blah, blah, blah. So I wanted that to encapsulate the whole man. And my other story on that is, if I stood up in the city when I worked with 300 guys and I was like, ding, 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 hey guys, who wants to come to a mental health event for men this weekend? You'd have, fuck no, someone to throw a shoe at you and piss off. Whereas if you said, hey guys, there's a strength and resilience event this weekend for men. We've got special forces guys, we've got ex-footballers, we've got, millionaire crypto experts. Who wants to come? I've got my hand in the air. Yeah. And I've created it to help me when I was 36 in the city, basically. And that's pretty much where we are at the moment. I think we're about to, or just working on launching a whole man membership so that guys can develop their network. So they're not just coming to me and me feeding stuff out. It is more of the guy knows where others live. The guy knows he can call on them and what they do and what their speciality is. Yeah. Great example, one of our previous dinners last year, which is further down the country, two of the guys sat there and found out they've been to 3 or 4 events together and didn't realize they live in the same street. And they were like, what? And it's like, no, I live there. Like, no, I live there. I live there. And I was like, listen, if we had a kind of a database of guys, you could find that there's some guys around your area or maybe your country, might not be in the UK, because we've got guys from 40 different countries that listen to the podcast. So who knows how things might develop. So in a nutshell, Whole Man Academy is about helping a guy live his own version of an epic life. Because I bet you and I have different versions of it. And mine isn't running $1 billion business and working all the hours. Mine is spending as much time as I can with my kids and family, having a bit of time to relax and doing a job I love, or, a career I love, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're actually not far off on that definition of epic. What I really like about what you're doing is that you're taking the entire perspective of what men, who we claim to be as men, mm-hmm. and looking at all parts of it. And that's why in the introduction there, for me, as I was thinking about and looking at your work and the work that you're doing and the similarities to the work that we're doing here at the Awakened Man, is that we take it as in a similar path. And our focus is still a bit more on, while we look at the wheel of life perspective, we have a little integrity challenge that I put the guys through to give them a sense of where they're maybe lacking some area of their life. But really the focus is on helping them deal with the parts of themselves that they don't like. And when we can accept and integrate that, then it gives them an opportunity to really grow and expand as men, because we end up by projecting that part onto others and into our lives. And then we wonder why our life is the way it is. And then when we can look at it from a broader perspective. So I really like the work that you're doing, very similar to us. And that's what I think is really cool about men's work, is that we all come from a little bit of different perspective. It's how the experiences that we've had in life, and that's how we end up by changing and evolving. And so tell me what's happening for men over in on your side of the pond there. What's the biggest threat facing men today? And what can they do about dealing with it?
The government.
Yeah.
Simple. Well, I'd say the government, it depends how deep down the rabbit hole you want to go, but the government don't actually run there's 1 or 2 companies that basically own every other company in the world. And I've had great fun talking to people about that, because to use a term which is slightly condescending, but it blows people's tiny minds, because you say, like, right, name a big company, and they'll say, oh, whoever, and you go, they're owned by X and X. No, they're not. They're whoever and whoever. And you say, yes, and those companies are owned by that company, and those companies are owned by that company. Oh, what about this bank? And you go, no, they're major shareholders of that bank. Mm-hmm. Oh, what about Pepsi Cola? Yes, there is PepsiCo, and PepsiCo are owned by this company. And people go, oh, right, okay. So it's a great question. And often I'll ask guys something similar, and they'll kind of not really be sure what to say the threat is, or, suicide and stuff. Well, suicide doesn't just happen. Suicide comes from somewhere. And some people don't like the term committing suicide. Others would rather it be taking your own life. For me, I'm like, listen, if you're too busy worrying about what the term is, I think there's more important things than that to worry about.
Yeah.
But yeah, for guys, I think these are a big threat.
Mm-hmm.
Mobile phones, for your procrastination, for keeping it near your head, and Wi-Fi as well, for being spied on. We all know you might talk about, oh, hey, Elaine, I'm thinking about going camping next weekend. I've never spoken about it before. And then you'll turn YouTube on and they'll be like, camping gear. And you go, what? So yeah, for me, the biggest threat is the powers that be, or as one of our second most popular ever podcasts is a guy called Neil Kramer. And if there's only one podcast out of all ours that I suggest people listen to, it's that one. And people come back and say, fucking hell, I had to listen to it twice. It's that good. And not because it's me, it's because I just asked some questions and let the guy talk. But anyway, he calls it empire. And empire, kind of encapsulates what the problem is at the moment. I mean, in the UK, our NHS is being slowly destroyed. You can argue whether it's deliberate or not, but people are waiting 12 hours in accident emergency now. In some places, that's their average waiting time. In some places in the UK, considering how much tax we pay as well.
Yeah.
You've got the oil prices and the petrol prices, which were put up artificially. And when the prices drop down, they don't drop down for the consumer or the end consumer. And I worked in carbon emissions broking for 8 years, and energy trading. So I'm not an expert, but I know a bit. Look at the food that people are eating. The quality of it is really poor, and what it's wrapped in and what it's sprayed in. You look at the chemicals that are surrounding us in the house and in the your mattress, what's that made from, and the chemicals that people put on their body through the moisturizers and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a big onslaught, but it's a silent one generally. The other one, of course, to go down the rabbit hole, is of now the agenda of confusing people about their sex. So it doesn't work to try and confuse adults, but if you try and confuse children at school, then in 5 or 10 years' time, you're going to have a lot of people that don't know if they're Arthur or Martha.
Yeah.
And that is knowing people who have got kids. Thankfully, our kids, don't go to school. Then we call it home educated because we're not trying to replicate school at home,
right? Which
is a challenge in itself. It's not easy, but it'll be rewarding. But, we know people now that have got kids at senior school that are just coming back and, it's not a technical term, but just being like, what the fuck are they being taught?
Yeah.
Like about white privilege, about the fact that they're racist and they don't know it. And they've got to be allies to anybody that decides they can identify as a penguin or a cat or God knows what else. Yeah. And you have to ask, or when you do bother to look at where does all that agenda come from, if you trace it back, it's not very nice people. And they don't have a great deal they're not doing it for the care of the children to be enlightened. They're doing it for slightly sicker, nefarious purposes. But again, that could be another whole hour's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. What a breath of fresh air to really talk about the big picture of what men are faced with, because it's one thing for us to deal with, like you said, considering taking our lives, the challenges that we're faced, but it stems from somewhere and we don't have enough of these conversations. And what I really like is I listen to Andy Frisella's podcast, and Andy's really famous to say, our rebellion is to become excellent at who we are, is to just excel and get better, and to recognize that if we don't understand what's happening, the macro and microeconomics around us, then how can we be men to lead our families and our communities if we're just going to stick our head in the sand and not understand what's going on? And I would suggest that it's probably, as depending on the information you're looking at, whether it's a black rock or a black stone, there's a lot of weird stuff going on right now. And I think what's happened, if there's anything good that came out of this pandemic, it's people are starting to wake up to say and realize
there's something deeply wrong.
There's something deeply wrong. And we've been hoodwinked for a long time, a long time. And when we recognize that, okay, when you're the most trusted person, I know we have this survey here in Canada, and for years and years, like decades, the most trusted person in the country would be the CBC news anchor of the decade.
Yeah.
And that says a lot about how we think that we choose not to spend any time to figure out what's really going on. And when that's who we're looking up to Peter Mansbridge and those are names of the past, is makes you want to really scratch your head.
You've hit on an important topic on we've just started covering, but like calling it, say, the awakened man, because there's a question I like to pose to people, which is, how do you know if you've been brainwashed? And I was, prior to all the COVID bullshit, some of the stuff I would have argued with people about that I was completely wrong about. I didn't have a clue what I was talking about, but because I watched the news and I'd read the Daily Mail, I was like, I've read it in the paper. I know what's going on. And now, my best saying is everything you know is wrong, or at least question everything about what you read in the newspapers, what you see on TV, what you see in films, all these different things. And to bring that back to threats to men, I've watched some really great stuff on, like, let's call it hypnosis, mass hypnosis. And when you look at things like Darren Brown in this country, where he would create a whole kind of scene to see how far someone would go if they'd killed someone because they thought they'd done something they shouldn't. And of course, everybody but that person would be an actor to create this. And in the end, that person would pull the trigger or just about to. And you realize how easy some people are being hypnotized. And unfortunately, a lot of people are sleepwalking through life. But, you try and tell someone that, and that was me a few years ago, or you're just going to offend them. But you were right. A lot of people in the last, year or two have looked around and just said, something's not right. I don't get it. And most people can't get the full picture. It's a big jigsaw. And I always say, listen, there's a big wall behind me. I say, listen, if you give me 3 hours and a massive whiteboard, I don't know everything, but I could start to help you put things together.
Yeah.
But, also some people don't want to know.
Yeah. It's because, ignorance is bliss, unfortunately. And the more that we know, the more that we realize just how much we don't know about things. And then that gives us a sense of insecurity. Yeah. And really, in the end, at our core selves, man or woman, we want to have a sense of safety, of security. And sometimes that's a big step for guys to take out of there. And for me, my belief is that it's because, as raised as young boys, that we were just, children to be seen and not heard. We were suppressed to really deal with stuff. And so we didn't have a healthy way to deal with our emotions. Number one, how to spend time and create relationships. And then as we get older, we take these really their survival habits that have kept us going, and we replay these programs over and over and over again until one day, hopefully, we wake up. Something happens to jar us awake. And I have a gentleman in our work. I have everywhere from a 30-year-old, and we just had a new gentleman come and join us. He's 65, and it's starting that awakening process is happening for him. And my heart just goes out to these men as we're doing our work and we're understanding how all the pieces fit together. And maybe you don't need to see the entire spider web, but you need to see enough of it. Yeah. You get a sense of how to take the next step forward in your life.
I tell you what, it's really nice what you said there about, a guy who's, let's say, 65, because I think sometimes people, they just need to be shown something for it to just, it pops open the can and then they start sniffing around. So my dad was a great example. Dad's a smart guy. He worked. My dad's one of those, it does my head in, because he's very clever in the numerical or that side of things, because he worked for Barclays Bank for many years. And then when he got to his 40s, he basically said, I don't want to do this anymore. I hardly ever see my kids. So he quit, and we bought a farm down at the South Coast, which was really hard. But for me growing up, I saw my dad every day, which is fantastic. But he can also do electrical wiring, plumbing. He's rebuilt car engines. He's built stables. He knows how every power tool works. If your car breaks down, he knows. I'm shit at stuff like that. But what I would say with him is, I was going on and on and on at him through all this, saying, listen, we're not being told the truth. You can argue about what the truth is, but we know that what we're being told isn't it. And it was hard for him to start with, because it is hard when everything's like you're being told you're wrong. And then he listened to 1 hour or 2 hour podcast with me. And we were actually putting my son's a bed together, a bunk bed for two of our kids. And it was a 2 or 3 hour job, which turned into about 6 hours. And I just put this podcast on in the background. And it was the guy I said I interviewed on the podcast, Neil Kramer. And my dad was like, what and what and what? And at the end of it, it kind of like opened up a little gap. And since then, my dad has done loads of his own research. And he said to me a while ago, all I know now is I was born and I'm here today. And I don't know everything. Everything else in between feels like it's a bit of a lie. Mm. And I was like, yep.
Yeah.
Keep digging.
Yeah, absolutely. And kudos to your father for having the openness enough to, listen to the podcast and then start to do some exploration. And really, I think in our work, we can just, as you were saying, we just crack open that walnut a little bit and allow something to come in there. Then I think we're doing good work here.
Yeah.
Hey, what is the one thing in doing all this men's work that you're finding that you still need to work on?
The one thing I found really hard when I started working for myself was when you had a job, you basically turned up at 6:45 and you knew what to do from 7 till, 5 or 6. And then you went home, and unless you're out with the clients, you basically switched off. But I find it really hard to switch off because also I love what the Whole Man Academy, I love what I do. But probably like yourself, every hour I could email more guys to get on a podcast. I could, write more e-letters. I could publish more content. I could do some more videos. I could create a new online course. There's never an ending thing. And I literally sometimes lay in bed at night thinking, I've just come up with this great idea for a LinkedIn post. And so for me, it's like sometimes I need to learn how to switch off more because, that's at least it's a good, I'm not switching off of something because I hate it. It's because my mind is always going on. But Neil Kramer, when I spoke to him, one of the big things was about men spending time contemplating. So not doing anything else, but just contemplating and not trying to get somewhere, not trying to meditate to clear your mind, but just being. And I was like, that's hard, especially when you've got 3 kids now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great answer. I find the same thing as well, to be able to shut it off, right? Because I'll be same thing. And I'm a bit of a night hawk. And so I like to stay up a little bit later. And that's normally when I have my creative juices going. And I just know that when I come into the home office here and I sit down at the computer and start typing away at something, that 2 hours it just goes.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, I guess it's 1:00 in the morning. Maybe I should go to bed.
Yeah, go to bed. Yeah. Yeah. Very similar.
Yeah. But it's not because it's not about work that we don't like to do. It's because it is work that we love to do. And
you find it hard to stop.
Yeah. It's just a passion that drives us.
Yeah.
What would you recommend are your top 3 suggestions for any man that wants to take control of his life? What should he be doing?
The first one is, when I talk about energy, the reason I developed the energy protocol course was because it encapsulated what I thought was important for a guy, which again was, a little bit of fitness, your mindset, what you're eating and drinking, how you're thinking and sleeping as well. And it's not highly technical stuff. And, just optimizing those basics to start with is one of the really important things, I think, because again, if you do burn the candle at both ends and you end up like losing out on sleep, it might not feel like it now, but it will catch up with you at some point, and eating a load of crap, doing that kind of stuff. So just taking care of yourself is probably, I think, one of the most important things to start with. And also having your relationships around you. I always think for the average guy, if he's got a partner, I always hark back to, there's that saying of like happy wife, happy life. Now, we could break that down and say that's not true because blah, blah, blah. But I interviewed a former police detective from the US, and he moved and left to be a men's coach. And I interviewed on the podcast, and he said one thing which I thought was great. And he said, if you want, see how a relationship blossoms, if you go to your partner and say this simple question, you say, what can I do to make your day a 10? And, often like with my partner, she might literally be like, can you just empty the dishwasher for me and do something, whatever else it is that she's been wanting you to do for a while. So they're not asking you to like climb Mount Everest or, write a song here. We often, but you could apply that question to your work, or you could say to your team, like, what could I do to make your week at work a 10?
Yeah.
It opens up. And I was just like, damn, I love that.
Yeah. Love that. Love that as well. I just wrote that question down.
Yeah.
What a great takeaway.
Awesome.
Love it. Let's think about where we are today, but then we fast forward 20 years from now. And as you look back on today, you think about legacy. What would legacy look like to you? What would that ultimately become?
Yeah, I think 20 years from now, whether the Whole Man Academy would still be running, who knows? I mean, to be honest, I think if you dial it back to the middle of our conversation, I think the next year or two are going to be very, very interesting for the economy, for freedom, and with the introduction of AI, which I think is it's like a lot of things, like water. If you have too much water, you'll drown. If you don't have any, you'll die. So AI, and I've used it, and I think it's great to an extent, but it's quite disturbing to see. I read this week someone that's basically lost their job working for a big company because they dealt with, let's just say, copywriting for argument's sake, but basically they've been told, well, we've got like 5 or 6 people that we pay retainers to. We only need one now because they can generate it all through AI. And you're like, So for me, it's really hard to know where legacy goes, because I think there will be a very interesting next couple of years. But if nothing happened, I mean, the banks are going to collapse. I do believe. I think that we'll see. I predicted Credit Suisse would go under. I wrote about that 2 years ago, and Deutsche will be one of the ones. If I won't be surprised if Deutsche are as well. But it seems like that they're encouraging fear in keeping your money in the little banks, which means everybody will take their money out and put it in the big banks. And the big banks are the one that's controlled by the people that do everything else.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting one to go down. But legacy wise, I'd love the Whole Man Academy to have spread to, having big events like, 1,000 men. I mean, I've always had this thing of like, someone said something about like 1,000 man project or something like that. I don't know. It's in my head, but not talking of like massive, but, having events where you've got hundreds of men come along and really feel like they belong to a movement. That for me would be enough of a legacy on the Whole Man Academy front, taking family and all the other stuff aside. That would be super cool to have regular events where guys get together and, really kind of, I don't know, explode through things they're finding hard.
Outstanding. I have no doubt that exactly what will transpire with Whole Man Academy. Anthony, of everything we had an opportunity to speak about today, and maybe there was a topic we didn't get a chance to dive into, what would be the one takeaway you'd want our listeners to have?
For me, it's about, I was using the term for one, I think I said, like questioning everything. So questioning like where you are in life, if looking at yourself, and then questioning things around you, because I think there's a lack of that at the moment. What am I putting in my body? What am I letting people inject me with? What's being sprayed in the air? What am I watching on TV? What clothes am I putting in my back? It sounds like an exhaustive process, but the sooner you start kind of questioning, why am I being told this? What's someone's ulterior motive? That can open up a real kind of a pathway for you to become more awake, basically.
Yeah, I love that. It's about being conscious, right? Being aware of all of our choices and decisions and taking purposeful action. So, I just want to say thanks, Anthony, for spending time with me today. And I think you gave us an opportunity. We have actually left a few breadcrumbs for guys to understand what it really means to be a whole man. Now, if they were interested in getting in hold of you and in getting involved with the Whole Man Academy, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can firstly just check out our website, which is wholemanacademy.com. And the main thing I point people to is we have been publishing since 2019 the Whole Man Journal, which is insights to maximize your mindset, body, and performance, because it's all encapsulating. And basically, you could just sign up for that. And there's hundreds of guys across the world, professional men who read it, enjoy it, email me back, sometimes say, hey, I'm implementing this or that or whatever it is. And that's always nice when you get that feedback that you're helping people basically, live their own version of epic life. So yeah, head to the website or go and listen to the podcast.
Love it. Awesome. I'll make sure that all that information is in the show notes for today's episode so folks can get out and read and get a hold of you. I just want to say once again, thank you so much, brother. It was an outstanding conversation.
It's been a pleasure. I hope to do it again soon.
We will.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is the Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net, and start forging a new destiny today.